Hello, we're continuing our study in 2 Samuel. Today we're going to be in chapters 16 and 17, which is the continuing story of the consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba, as predicted by Nathan, is now reaping havoc in his own family. Beginning back in chapter 13, we begin the split or the conflict between David and some of his sons, particularly Absalom here. It's the first son that's going to rebel. And we're continuing that same account of this rebellion. In chapter 15, Absalom has persuaded many people in Israel that he should be the new king, and his troops are marching on Jerusalem, and David is caught by surprise and forced to leave. In chapter 16:1, we see that David pressed a little beyond the summit. Now the summit here is probably the Mount of Olives. You ought to see chapter 15, verse 30. And as he is leaving, several different groups, or really different people, are going to meet him. Some are going to be from Saul's house, and they're going to be very supportive. Others are from Saul's tribe, and they're going to be very critical. Matter of fact, even pronouncing religious curse is on David, and believing that this is part of Yahweh's plan. So it's going to be several different folks react to David's son, forcing him to flee. The first one we have is Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. Remember back earlier, he was the administrator of Saul's lands, and apparently he was reaping the benefit of that. When David wanted to show his faithfulness to his covenant with Jonathan, and there's one crippled son of Jonathan left, Mephibosheth. And so David gave all the property of Saul. Apparently that was the right of the king to do that. We'll see him do that in this study tonight. He's going to give it to Mephibosheth, and Ziba and his sons are simply to help Mephibosheth. Well, he comes to him, Ziba, with 2 saddled donkeys, and he's going to have bread and fruit and things like that. 1 jug of wine sounds ridiculous, and all these other large amounts of things. But it was his way of saying, David, I'm so sorry what's happening. I want you to know I'm for you. And this is my way of saying, let me help a little bit. Now, this sets the stage. For the king said to Ziba in verse 2, why do you have these? And Ziba said, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride, the bread and the summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for whoever is faint in the wilderness to drink. And the king said, where is your master? Now, word here in my New American Standards, where is your master's son? In the NIV, it's grandson. These Hebrew terms for family relationships are very fluid and can mean son or grandson or great-grandson. And so here it's obviously grandson in context. And Ziba said to the king, behold, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. Now there's a real problem here, and there's been 2 ways of looking at this. Number 1, that simply Ziba is lying. He's making this up to somehow regain the property for himself, to win David's favor. But you know, the one thing that militates against that is, David looked in a pretty bad situation right now. It looked like all of Israel was going with his son Absalom. I'm not sure Ziba could realistically expect David to be back on the throne. So here he is siding with someone who seems to be on the losing side. That may say he's not lying. Now, the other thing they say is that this truly reflects Mephibosheth's feelings. Now, David confronts Mephibosheth in chapter 19, verse 24 through 30. Mephibosheth says that Ziba is lying, that he wanted to go with David, and they saddled a donkey for him, but he couldn't somehow work it out. Now, it seems that David is going to split the property between Mephibosheth and Ziba. That seems to imply either he does not know who's lying, or he believes Mephibosheth is lying. I'm not really sure. It's so hard to tell from this particular account if Ziba is telling the truth or simply trying to gain favor through a lie. So the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. Again, he's using his kingly right of giving land to whoever he will. He's going to modify that in chapter 19 to let Mephibosheth retain half and Ziba retain half. When David came to Bahurim, behold, there came out there a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. Now this is one of the family, one of the relatives of Saul somehow. And he is going to come out. Look what happens. And he threw stones at David and all the servants of the King David and all the people and all the mighty men who were on his right and on his left. And thus Shimei said to when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed, you worthless fellow. Well, this is a pretty mild translation. I mean, these are some pretty strong Hebrew words accusing him of shedding innocent blood. This last term, worthless fellow, is very strong in Hebrew. It would be a very serious curse, as David alludes to later on, I think in chapter 19. Now, why doesn't David just cut this fellow's tongue out? Hang him up by his thumbs. Look at verse 8, what this man says. The Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul. Now, what exactly does that refer to? David hasn't shed any blood of the house of Saul. Maybe it's a reference somehow that he thought David was involved in Saul and Jonathan's death. That David somehow was in cahoots with the Amalekite that says he killed Saul, though we think Saul killed himself. Maybe he's saying David had some part in the death of Abner. Maybe he's saying David had some part in the death of Ishbosheth. Many scholars say that the bloodshed of Saul's family found in 2 Samuel 21 is out of chronological order and really should go before this chapter, and therefore it's a reference to that. We don't know exactly what it's referring to. Now, and Abishai, now of course Abishai is Joab's brother. I mean, they're the sons of thunder of the Old Testament. They're just tough. Said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over now and cut off his head. He was a pretty expedient person. He knew how to get the job done. And David says, for 3 reasons, let this man live. Number 1 is found in verse 10. If the Lord has told him, curse David, then who shall say, why have you done so? The man is accusing David by using the name of Yahweh. David says, it just may be that God is judging my household for my sins. And maybe this man is reflecting Yahweh's will, and if he is, who am I to stop him? Now the second one is found in verse 11, where he says, my son who came out from me seeks my life. He's saying, number 2, this whole situation is not caused by this man, it's caused by my own son. Why should I kill this man? Because I'm having to flee from my own flesh and blood. Number 3 is in verse 12. Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and return good to me instead of his cursing this day. David lays it before the Lord and says, I'm going to let the Lord work this out. If God's not in it, maybe he'll bring me back to power. I'm going to trust in the Lord. I'm going to leave my fortunes to him. I'm not going to avenge myself. I'm not going to defend myself to this man. I'm going to let the Lord take care of it. And he moves right on. And the man continues to curse him and with very strong terms. David believed that God was in control of his life. Well, that's a lesson all of us need to learn. Our lives are not controlled by luck or chance or fate or horoscopes or what if or maybe could be's. God's in control of his world, and especially the lives of his children. I think you ought to look at chapter 15, verse 25 and 26, and chapter 16, verse 12, for others expressions of this theological truth that God is the one in control of history. Now, though God is in control of history, and I don't believe David believes that, he's also going to send these counselors back to Jerusalem to try to thwart the counsel of the other wise men who were left. David believed that God's in control of history, but he does some actions by sending one of these men back. Now, is that a conflict? I think not. I think it's just the way that God works in his world. We're to do what we think is best, but in the end, we're to trust it to God. And I feel very comfortable with that. I hope you feel comfortable with that tension in all of our lives. Now, down about verse 15. Then Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. Now, Ahithophel is a very famous counselor. You might want to see, I believe it's over here in chapter 16, verse 23 or so. No, that's not it. Where is old Ahithophel? It may be 23:34, but we will see it in our lesson today that it's down in verse 23 of this chapter, chapter 16, verse 23. Very wise man, a counselor of David. You say, well, if he's a wise man, so wise that when he spoke it was as good as inquiring of the high priest God's will. Why did this man go with Absalom and not stay faithful to David? This is only speculation. We can't be certain. But if you will compare 2 Samuel 11:3 and 2 Samuel 23:34, you will find that this man may have been Bathsheba's grandfather. Can you sense the way the family still may be angry, the way David took Bathsheba, killed her husband, and all of that? If that's true, you can see the undercurrent that must have been in David's throne. Now it came about that Hushai is another counselor. We see him in chapter 15, verses 32 through 37. Apparently he was also a counselor of David. He came out. He was known as a friend of David. But David says, you need to go back, and he goes back now, and he's going to confront Absalom. And he's going to be lying about the fact that he is really not supporting David, he's supporting Absalom. The man goes through a series of flatteries here where he really doesn't say anything about his allegiance to Absalom as much as he says his allegiance is to the people of God, to the man whom God's people have chosen, to the man that God has chosen to lead his people. Absalom assumes this all refers to him, when in reality the man's not lying. He's just flattering Absalom with very vague references. And you see this in verse 18. Number one, the Lord's choice, the people's choice, and the men of Israel have chosen. And you can see that. And apparently, we're not sure how much Absalom believed this, but apparently he took the advice of this man originally, although when you read the rest of 2 Samuel, he really did take Ahithophel's advice very soon and followed out those plans. Now, and Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your advice what to do. Now, Ahithophel's advice is very precise. It seems to be very logical. It's going to involve the death of only one man, David, and it's going to involve striking right now while they're tired and confused. Now, this was a very good, very specific military plan. Now, it basically went along this lines. If you kill the head, the body will die also. He said to Absalom, if we can catch David tonight and kill David only, the rest of the army, the rest of the people will come right back to you. But do it right now. Now, some have said since he wanted 12,000 men, that means every one of the tribes involved, but we're not sure about that. In chapter 16, the precise thing here is that he go into David's concubines. Now, David left some of his concubines, semi-legal wives, to take care of the palace in Jerusalem. Now, Ahithophel said, if the people see that you've taken them sexually as your wives, they will know two things. The break between you and your father is once and for all. You've made yourself odious or really smell bad to your father by doing this. You've burnt your bridges, and they know you're serious about taking over the throne. Now, so he went on the roof, and he pitched a tent. Many people believe this would be a marriage tent, symbolizing he's the new king. He's taken the old king's wives. Some believe the fact that he's taken these wives was not just a sign that he claimed to be the new king, but it was maybe a sign that the old king was dead. Now, of course, David was not dead, but the implication was, I am going to kill him. He will be dead soon, and I'm taking his wives. Maybe that's behind here. I'm just not sure. On the roof. Now, this on the roof is interesting. Does that mean in plain sight so all the people can see? Maybe so. But others say it's a direct fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy of chapter 12, verse 11 and 12, concerning that David's wives will be taken publicly as he has taken Uriah's wife secretly. And that may very well be true. It's obvious this whole problematical relationship between David and his sons was because of the results of his sin with Bathsheba. In verse 23, Ahithophel is said to be a very, very godly man, apparently a very wise counselor. And he's, as one who inquires of the word of the Lord, means you can ask Ahithophel, and his word is as good as the Urim and the Thummim that the high priest has. What a compliment. Now in chapter 17 becomes the military advice, and he wants to take some troops. He wants to pursue David that night to kill the king alone. And the plan pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel, verse 4. But Absalom, either being young or wanting more counsel, asked this other man, Hushai. And Hushai, of course, is David's spy at court. He goes into this long kind of nebulous rigmarole about, no, you better wait. David's got the best army. They're very trained. David is a well-seasoned soldier. He won't sleep in the camp tonight. He'll sleep up in the caves. If you raid it, you won't kill him, but you'll lose a lot of your men because they're good soldiers, and then Israel won't be sure. Wait till you get all of Israel behind you and take a large army over there. And for some reason, Absalom, I think he didn't take this advice, but he hesitated enough for a few hours that it allowed David to get away. Because what's going to happen, this man is going to send word by the priest, Abiathar and Zadok's sons, to David not to spend the night at the fords of Jordan, but to go on and cross over into Gilead, into the Transjordan area, just in case Absalom changes his mind, just in case he takes Ahithophel's advice. And, of course, that's what happened. Notice in verse 11, this strange little phrase, from Dan even to Beersheba. That becomes an idiom to describe the whole promised land. Now, if you remember back in Joshua, Dan draws lots to inherit land just north of Judah and just to the west of Benjamin, close to the Philistine area. But you learn from Judges, chapters 19 through 21, that Dan decided to move. And without apparently asking God's will, they didn't like where they were. It was too hard to gain their land. And they moved way far to the north and captured a Canaanite city there, and that became the city of Dan. So Dan, the city in the far north, to Beersheba, the city in southern Judah, became a way of referring to all the promised land. Look at verse 14. Then Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord has ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel in order that the Lord might bring calamity on Absalom. Notice that though this counselor was wise and known for his teaching, he still is in control of God. And God will use David's prayer of chapter 15, verse 31 that says, oh, may God thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. And he does. And this is an affirmation of that right here. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar. Now these are the two priests. We're not sure if they're both of the line of Levi, though that seems to be true from Chronicles. Some say that Zadok was the high priest of Jebus, but I don't think we can really back that up. They were friends of David, as we understand from chapter 15, verses 24 through 29, and chapter 15, verses 35 and 36. Now two of their sons, in verse 14, were hiding at a spring. It's a spring of the Kidron River, very close to the southern end of the city of Jerusalem, where the valley of Hinnom is. They were hiding there, and a maidservant would go down to the spring like she was getting water and pass on the information so they could take it to David. Apparently somebody saw them doing that in verse 18, and they had to flee. Now, it's interesting to me, they fled to the village where Shimei lived, the very anti-David, very pro-Saul man earlier that cursed David. They fled to his village, and a family there hid them from Absalom. Now, this shows that there was that David had supporters throughout the country, even in this very city where the anti-David feelings were so strong. This family helped. And it's Barum. You might want to see chapter 16, verse 5. Now, what they did, there was apparently a well out in the courtyard. The men climbed down the well. They covered the well and then kind of put sand or dirt or straw around it where you couldn't tell where the well was. And Absalom's men came, looked for them, could not find them, and left. And these two men took word to David. Do not camp on the western side of Jordan. No matter how tired you are, no matter how late it is, get your troops across. And they did that, and I think you can see that clearly as you read through here. Notice now that when Ahithophel finds out that his advice is not taken immediately because his advice was predicated on immediate action, capturing them while they are tired, killing one man. Now, what he did, he went home. He set his things in business, maybe like wrote his will for thus, and he hung himself. This is the only mention in all the Bible of a man that commits suicide not involved in a military campaign. Now, there's other folks who kill themselves, but they're kind of involved in military action. They're wounded or somehow. But here is a planned suicide. The fact that he says he's buried in the grave of his father is an implication that the suicide itself is not condemned. Some question the timing of this. We're not exactly sure of the chronology of Samuel, but exactly when he went and killed himself. After Absalom's defeat or immediately after his advice was not taken, we're just not sure. I have not had a chance to look this up yet, but I was looking in one of my sources today, and they were saying that in 2 Maccabees chapter 14, verses 41 through 46, if you have a Catholic Bible or maybe an Episcopal Bible, you would have a 2 Maccabees, a very good history of that period, the Maccabean revolt. It also mentions suicide in a non-negative sense. I do believe that the theology, it says that suicide is an unpardonable sin, that if you are a believer and you commit suicide, you lose heaven. That, in my opinion, is a false view of a works kind of righteousness, that our actions keep us with God. I don't believe we're on probation. I believe salvation's a free gift. I think suicide's always a tragedy. I think it's something that questions the will of God. But the Old Testament was quite a more difficult and cruel system than in our day. Notice that David fled in verse 24 back to the very city that was Ishbosheth's capital. We've learned from 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 8. And apparently even in this area, he had friends. Now we know that some of them are mentioned down in verse 27. There are 3 friends there. The first one mentioned, Shimei, is possibly from Ammonite royalty. At least he may have been the appointed governor of the province of Ammon. As you know, back in chapter 13, the whole cause of this was David not with the troops when they captured the capital, Rabbah of Ammon. And so this is a man who's an administrative person in this area. The second one is a friend of Mephibosheth, Maker there. And the third is a man that is going to be a good friend of David from now on, Barzillai. And you can read verse 27. They're going to bring food and all kinds of goods for David's people to eat, for the army. And that was a real gesture in this time of need. It looked like David was in big trouble. His army was much smaller than Absalom's army. He looked like that God had taken him off the throne. And these men who support him really show a kindness to David, probably not expecting reward, because they probably expected David to be defeated unless God intervenes. They're acting because of their love and care for David and their belief that he is the Lord's anointed and that somehow God may help him. Well, these 2 chapters, I think, are interesting. What you have to do with the Old Testament, you have to try to see the theology that's here and kind of apply it to our day in an analogous sense. It's always been my view of interpreting the Bible that you must go to the author's intent. Why did he record this? One of the things throughout this is that David is trusting in God's control of history. And also throughout this is the fact that even when you can't see it on the surface, God thwarts the counselor. God takes care of this. God is behind this. And David believes that, and you see his faith throughout. We also see how the crisis of life come and go, much of which is because of our own personal sin. This particular crisis is because of David's sin with Bathsheba and the problems of that working itself out in this who it will succeed him to the throne. And so I think when you see this becomes applicable to our lives, though we got to be careful not to apply specific points, but the theology behind that. I want to mention a good book for you. I hope you like the Old Testament. I hope you try to apply it to your life. The Authority of the Old Testament by John Bright is one of the best books I've ever read on how to make the Old Testament relevant to our New Testament period without proof texting or spiritualizing or being very legalistic with it. It's not an easy thing to do, but I hope you'll look at that book, The Authority of the Old Testament. I hope you'll think through how this applies to your life, and I hope, my friends, you'll see that God is in control of your life as he was in control of David's. You may not be king of Israel, but if you know him, he's with you, he cares for you, and nothing just happens to the people of God. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.